In the early days of Canaan, amidst Jacob's sprawling tents and the dry heat of the Promised Land, a young man named Joseph stood out among his 11 brothers. Not only was he his father's favorite son, the fruit of his late love for Rachel, but also for a singular gleam in his eyes, a foreshadowing of a destiny he himself could scarcely comprehend. Jacob, captivated by Joseph's grace and precocious intelligence, unequivocally demonstrated his favor, bestowing upon him a richly adorned tunic, a visible symbol of his distinction that, instead of uniting, sowed discord and envy in the hearts of his other sons. That colorful coat, woven with threads of paternal pride and fraternal ignorance, became the spark of a dark plot that would plunge Joseph into an abyss of suffering, proving the fragility of family bonds when confronted by the bitterness of rivalry. The dreams that God granted Joseph were like glimpses of a glorious future, but his innocent sharing of them with his brothers only intensified the flame of animosity that already burned in their hearts. He dreamed of sheaves of wheat, bowing down in reverence to his own sheaf, and of the sun, the moon, and 11 stars prostrating themselves before him. These visions, interpreted by Joseph in his youthful candor as signs of his future greatness, were received by his brothers as intolerable affronts, fueling the conviction that he aspired to a power superior to theirs. Their already thin patience, frayed with each new dreamlike revelation, transforming rivalry into a visceral hatred that cried out for a drastic resolution. That young man, unaware of the depth of the evil that was germinating around him, walked inadvertently towards an encounter with a cruel fate, woven by the envious hands of those who should have been his support and protection. The opportunity to unleash their growing malevolence arose when Jacob sent Joseph to check on the welfare of his brothers, who were grazing the flock far from Hebron. Joseph's solitary journey, imbued with his father's trust and the innocence of his heart, led him directly to his tormentors. Upon spotting him from afar, the fury that had accumulated over the years overflowed, and plots of murder began to be secretly hatched. Reuben, the eldest, moved by a remnant of conscience, or perhaps by fear of the consequences for himself, intervened, proposing that instead of shedding blood, Joseph should be thrown into a nearby dry well, a fate he secretly hoped to reverse. Thus they stripped Joseph of his beloved tunic, the symbol of paternal favor that so tormented them, and cast him into the dark depths of that natural prison, sealing in that instant of cold cruelty the beginning of a long and painful ordeal that would test the limits of his faith and the depth of his character. While Joseph languished in the damp darkness of the well, his brothers, momentarily satisfying their thirst for revenge, plotted a deception to cover up their crime before their father. They dipped Joseph's tunic in the blood of a goat, disfiguring the symbol of paternal love into a macabre piece of evidence of a supposed tragedy. Upon returning to Jacob, they brought with them the stained garment, weaving a sorrowful narrative of a fateful encounter with a wild beast that had supposedly torn their beloved brother to pieces. The piercing pain that fell upon Jacob was overwhelming. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned his son for many days, refusing any comfort. Believing the terrible news, the patriarch plunged into deep mourning, unaware of the dark truth that his own sons had sealed in the depths of a well and in the falsehood of their words. Destiny, however, held other plans for Joseph. A caravan of Ishmaelite merchants on their way to Egypt with spices, balm, and myrrh passed near the well. Judah, another of the brothers, seeing an opportunity for profit amidst their wickedness, convinced the others not to let Joseph die there. Instead, he proposed selling him as a slave to the merchants. The idea, though cruel, seemed to absolve them of the guilt of murder and would still earn them some silver coins. Thus, Joseph was pulled out of the well, exchanged for 20 shekels. of silver and taken to a foreign land, far from his family and his homeland. That cold and calculated transaction marked the beginning of his journey to Egypt, a place that would become the stage for his suffering, but also for his eventual rise and the glorious manifestation of God's purpose in his life. In Egypt, Joseph was sold to Potiphar, a high-ranking official of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. Even in the midst of slavery, God's presence was with Joseph, and he found favor in the eyes of his master. Potiphar, noticing Joseph's diligence, integrity, and administrative skills, soon elevated him to a position of trust, placing him as supervisor over his entire household and all his possessions. God's blessing was evident in everything Joseph did, and Potiphar's house prospered under his management. However, this rise did not mean the end of his trials. Joseph's beauty attracted the attention of Potiphar's wife, who, consumed by lustful passion, repeatedly tried to seduce him. Joseph's firmness of character and loyalty to his master, and above all to God, prevented him from yielding to her advances, even under intense pressure. Jacob's favoritism, while understandable from the perspective of his love for Rachel and the son born to him in his old age, casts a shadow over the family dynamics. That colorful coat, a symbol of distinction, paradoxically exacerbated inequality and exposed the fragility of the human heart in the face of envy. How often in our own lives and in the stories that surround us do we see unequal treatment breed resentment and division? Joseph's story warns us about the importance of equity in relationships, not to suppress individual love, but to cultivate it in a way that does not hurt or exclude. The gleam in Joseph's eyes, interpreted by Jacob as a foreshadowing of greatness, was perhaps also a reflection of the purity of a heart not yet tainted by the world's malice. A purity that ironically would make him even more vulnerable to the shadows that surrounded him. That coat, therefore, was not just a gift, but a catalyst that revealed the dark depths of fraternal jealousy, a destructive force capable of dismantling the strongest blood ties. Joseph's dreams, though divinely inspired, reveal the complexity of communication between heaven and earth. His naivety in sharing them demonstrates a lack of perception of the evil that resided in his brothers' hearts. How often do we receive glimpses of a promising future, but impatience or a lack of wisdom in sharing these visions prematurely exposes us to misunderstanding and even hostility? The story reminds us that not every revelation should be uttered at any time, and to any person. There is a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to dream and a time to see dreams come true. The virulent reaction of the brothers to Joseph's dreams was not just envy of his future success, but also a reflection of their own feelings of inferiority and insecurity in the face of the apparent divine preference for their younger brother. Their hearts were closed to the possibility of recognizing God's hand in Joseph's life, preferring to interpret it as a threat to their own status. The act of throwing Joseph into the dry well reveals the depth of the brothers' moral degeneration. That well, which could have been a tomb, became a symbol of human cruelty and the apparent absence of justice. However, even in that act of extreme evil, we can glimpse the subtle hand of divine providence, manifested in Reuben's intervention, who, even hesitant, sought to spare Joseph's life. How often, in the midst of the greatest tribulations, do we find small acts of mercy or unexpected detours that prevent us from falling into the total abyss? The selling of Joseph as a slave, although a despicable act, paradoxically placed him on the path of his destiny. That moment of betrayal and loss marked the beginning of a journey through suffering, but also paved the way for his eventual exaltation and the fulfillment of God's purposes. The story teaches us that even the most perverse actions can somehow be cogs in a larger plan that transcends our immediate understanding. Faith in those dark moments resides in trusting that despite human wickedness, divine sovereignty prevails. The calculated coldness with which Joseph's brothers plotted his sale into slavery reveals the extent of the moral blindness that envy can inflict. By turning their own blood into merchandise, they not only dehumanized Joseph, but also tarnished the very essence of family ties. The pursuit of immediate relief from their resentment led them to an act of betrayal that would have lasting consequences for their entire lineage. How often in our lives do we allow negative feelings to guide us to decisions that, in the short term, seem to solve a problem, but in the long term, sow pain and regret? The story warns us about the importance of confronting destructive emotions, rather than allowing them to control our actions. Judah's proposal, seemingly pragmatic in suggesting sale instead of death, ironically demonstrates a more subtle, yet no less perverse, way of eliminating the perceived threat of Joseph. This dark bargain in the desert not only sealed the fate of a young man, but also exposed the fragility of human conscience when confronted by greed and fear. Joseph's journey to Egypt, begun under the weight of betrayal and slavery, paradoxically places him at the center of the stage, where the divine plan will begin to unfold in mysterious and unfathomable ways. The loss of his freedom and the separation from his family, though painful, transport him to a context where his unique gifts of dream interpretation and his moral integrity will not only be tested, but also elevated to the service of a greater purpose. How often in our lives does what seems like a catastrophic setback lead us to a new path, unexpected and full of potential? Joseph's story encourages us to maintain faith even in the darkest moments, trusting that God can use the most adverse circumstances to accomplish his purposes. Egypt, a strange and initially hostile land, will become the crucible where Joseph's character will be refined, and where the seeds of his future greatness will be planted in foreign soil. That young man, sold as a slave, unknowingly carried with him the keys to the salvation of his own family and an entire nation. Joseph's rise in Potiphar's household, even in the midst of his slavery, is a testament to the power of integrity and diligence. His faith did not abandon him in a foreign land, and his work ethic and loyalty were evident to the point of captivating his master's trust. This part of the story teaches us that our conduct and character can open doors even in the most unfavorable circumstances. God's blessing is not restricted to a place or a social condition. It accompanies those who remain faithful to his principles, even when facing injustice and oppression. However, the trial in Potiphar's house also reminds us that righteousness does not always exempt us from facing new forms of suffering. The temptation and false accusation leveled by Potiphar's wife represent another level of challenge, testing not only Joseph's integrity, but also his ability to remain faithful to God and his values amidst a powerful seduction and potential ruin. That period of relative prosperity was just a brief pause before a new and deeper descent into suffering, demonstrating that the journey of faith is often marked by unexpected highs and lows. Joseph's firm and constant refusal of Potiphar's wife's advances transformed lascivious admiration into vengeful resentment. Frustrated and humiliated, she concocted a plot to take revenge on the Hebrew slave who had dared to reject her affections. Taking advantage of a moment when they were alone in the house, she grabbed Joseph by his clothes, but he, preferring integrity to safety, broke free from her, leaving his cloak in the furious woman's hands. Feeling scorned, Potiphar's wife used the cloak as evidence of a false accusation, claiming that Joseph had tried to rape her. Faced with his wife's fury and the apparent evidence, Potiphar, consumed by anger and disappointment, did not hesitate to throw Joseph into the royal prison, a place reserved for the king's criminals. Once again, injustice and suffering fell upon Joseph, but even in the depths of the dungeon, God's presence remained with him, offering a thread of hope in the darkness. Despite the dark circumstances of the prison, God's favor continued to be with Joseph. The chief jailer, observing Joseph's exemplary conduct and trustworthy nature, soon elevated him to a position of responsibility among the other prisoners. Before long, Joseph was in charge of supervising the other inmates and managing the affairs of the prison. His integrity and leadership skills shone even in that environment of despair. Among the prisoners were the chief cupbearer and the chief baker of Pharaoh, who had fallen into disgrace and had been thrown into the same prison. One night, both had disturbing dreams, and there was no one there to interpret them. Joseph, demonstrating his compassion and faith, offered to listen to their dreams, acknowledging that the interpretation belonged to God. With humility and trust in God, Joseph listened attentively to the dreams of Pharaoh's two officials. To the chief cupbearer, who had dreamed of a vine, 3 branches, and offering wine to Pharaoh, Joseph revealed an interpretation of restoration. Within 3 days, he would be reinstated to his position. To the chief baker, whose dream involved 3 baskets of bread being eaten by birds, Joseph delivered a grim message. Within 3 days, he would be executed. Both interpretations came true, faithfully, exactly as Joseph had предсказал. To the restored chief cupbearer, Joseph made a simple request that he would remember him to Pharaoh and intercede for his release so that he could get out of that unjust prison. However, once free and back in the court, the chief cupbearer completely forgot about the young Hebrew who had brought him hope in the darkness. Joseph remained forgotten in prison, awaiting God's time for his deliverance. The false accusation by Potiphar's wife and Joseph's subsequent imprisonment confront us with the painful reality that righteousness is not always rewarded with immediate justice. Joseph, who chose integrity and loyalty to God and his master, paradoxically found himself punished for his virtue. This dark turn in his story echoes the experiences of many who, in doing what is right, face persecution and injustice. The narrative invites us to ponder the nature of trial and to question whether the absence of immediate earthly reward signifies divine abandonment. The prison, a place of oblivion and despair, becomes another stage in the development of Joseph's character, a crucible where his faith will be tested at even deeper levels. The cloak left behind, a symbol of his innocence and his accuser's malice, serves as a visual reminder that truth can be temporarily obscured by lies, but it cannot be erased forever. Joseph's ability to find favor, even in the most adverse circumstances, first in Potiphar's house and then in prison, reveals an essential quality for those who seek to live by faith: resilience and the ability to flourish where they are planted. Instead of succumbing to despair and bitterness, Joseph chose to maintain his integrity and use his gifts to serve others, even in an environment of suffering. His leadership among the prisoners and his willingness to help the cupbearer and the baker demonstrate an active faith that does not become paralyzed by injustice, but seeks opportunities to exercise love and compassion. This attitude teaches us that our character and skills can be instruments of God's grace, opening unexpected doors and allowing us to be light even in the darkest places. Joseph's story challenges us not to define our worth or our potential by the circumstances we face, but by the way we choose to respond to them. The chief cupbearer's forgetting of Joseph, after having his dreams interpreted and his freedom restored, is a harsh lesson about human ingratitude. How often are we benefited by the kindness of others in times of need, yet we fail to reciprocate or even remember those who extended a hand to us? Joseph's experience in prison, waiting in vain for the remembrance of someone he helped, can resonate with those who have felt forgotten or neglected after being helpful to others. This period of being forgotten was not a sign of divine abandonment, but perhaps a time of refining patience and dependence on God alone. Joseph did not place his faith in human gratitude, which is fallible and ephemeral, but in the faithfulness of a God who never forgets his purposes. The delay in his release, though frustrating for Joseph, was part of a larger plan that he could not yet understand. The story reminds us that God's timing does not always coincide with ours, and that waiting, though difficult, can be essential for the fulfillment of his perfect plans. Divine providence, though often invisible to our eyes, permeates every stage of Joseph's story. From the dream that foretold his exaltation to his unexpected arrival in Egypt and his subsequent imprisonment, each event, however adverse it seemed, was intrinsically linked to God's greater plan. The sale into slavery, the temptation in Potiphar's house, and the unjust imprisonment were not mere accidents of fate, but rather steps on a ladder that would lead him to a purpose far greater than he could imagine. This perspective encourages us to seek God's hand, even in the midst of difficulties, trusting that He is orchestrating all things for our good, even when we cannot understand His way. Faith, in this sense, is not the absence of trials, but the certainty that there is a purpose behind them, and that God is with us in every step of the journey. Joseph's humility and faith in acknowledging that the interpretation of dreams belonged to God are qualities that deeply resonate. In a world where many seek power and recognition through their abilities, Joseph points to a higher source of wisdom. His willingness to serve even in prison, using his gifts to help his fellow inmates, demonstrates a heart that remains faithful to divine principles regardless of the circumstances. This attitude challenges us to use our own talents and experiences to bless others, even when we find ourselves in difficult situations. Joseph's story reminds us that our worth is not in our position or our freedom, but in our ability to reflect God's love and grace in all circumstances of life. The chief cupbearer's forgetting of Joseph serves as a reminder of the fallibility of memory and the inconstancy of human gratitude. Placing our hope in other human beings will inevitably lead to disappointment at some point. True hope and security reside in God, whose faithfulness does not waver and whose timing is perfect even if it seems delayed in our eyes. The period in which Joseph remained forgotten in prison was not a wasted time, but rather a period of waiting and preparation for the moment when the divine plan would be fully revealed. This experience teaches us to cultivate patience and to trust in God's timing, even when circumstances lead us to question whether we have been forgotten. Joseph's deliverance would not come through human remembrance, but through the sovereign intervention of God at the right time. 2 long years passed since the chief cupbearer had been restored to his position, and Joseph remained in prison, his hope of human release dwindling with each passing day. However, in God's perfect timing, Pharaoh had 2 disturbing dreams in the same night, dreams that none of the magicians or wise men of Egypt could interpret. The first dream was about 7 fat cows being devoured by 7 lean and ugly cows. The second dream involved 7 good ears of wheat being swallowed up by 7 withered ears, scorched by the east wind. Pharaoh, deeply troubled by these enigmatic visions, summoned all his counselors, but none of them were able to offer a satisfactory explanation. It was then that the chief cupbearer's memory was finally stirred. He remembered the young Hebrew man in the prison who had accurately interpreted his dreams. With urgency, Pharaoh sent for Joseph from the prison. He was quickly brought out, shaved and dressed in clean clothes, preparing to appear before the ruler of Egypt. When presented to Pharaoh, Joseph demonstrated humility, stating that he did not possess the power to interpret dreams himself, but that God would give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Pharaoh then recounted his enigmatic dreams to Joseph, describing the cows and the ears of wheat in vivid detail. Joseph, listening attentively, recognized the unified message behind the 2 visions. With divinely inspired wisdom and clarity, he revealed to Pharaoh that the two dreams foretold 7 years of great abundance throughout the land of Egypt, followed by 7 years of severe famine that would consume all the previous plenty. Not only did Joseph interpret the dreams, but he also offered Pharaoh a wise plan to deal with the impending crisis. He advised Pharaoh to appoint prudent and wise men to oversee the collection of 1/5 of all agricultural production during the 7 years of abundance. These supplies would be stored in royal granaries and kept under control to be distributed during the 7 years of famine, thus ensuring the survival of the Egyptian people and neighboring lands. Pharaoh and his officials were impressed by Joseph's wisdom and insight. Recognizing the presence of the Spirit of God in this young Hebrew man, Pharaoh declared that there was no one as discerning and wise as Joseph to oversee the entire land of Egypt. In that instant, Joseph's fortunes changed dramatically. From the dark dungeon, he was elevated to the position of governor over all of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself in power and authority. The transformation in Joseph's fortunes from forgotten prisoner to exalted governor is a powerful reminder that our story does not end in our moments of greatest difficulty. God is capable of bringing about surprising reversals and elevating us to positions of influence we never imagined. The key to this transformation in Joseph's life lies in his unwavering faith, his constant integrity, and his willingness to use his gifts to serve others, even when there was no prospect of personal reward. His story inspires us to remain faithful to our principles, to develop our talents, and to trust in God's plan for our lives, even when the path ahead seems uncertain or dark. Joseph's exaltation was not just for his own benefit, but to fulfill a greater purpose of salvation and restoration, both for his family and for the nation that had taken him in. Joseph, now 30 years old, took charge of the entire land of Egypt. With wisdom and diligence, he traveled throughout the country, organizing the collection of surplus grain during the 7 years of great abundance. Granaries were built and filled to overflowing with grain under the careful supervision of Joseph and his administrators. The abundance was so great that it became immeasurable, like the sand of the sea. During this period, Joseph married Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, and had 2 sons, Manasseh, whose name meant God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house, and Ephraim, which meant God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. These names reflected the way Joseph saw God's work in his life, turning his pain into forgetfulness and his affliction into fruitfulness. Then, just as Predskazal, the 7 years of abundance came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to plague the land. The famine spread to all the neighboring nations, but throughout the land of Egypt there was bread, for Joseph had foreseen and prepared for this time. When the famine became severe in the land of Canaan, Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt and sent his 10 older sons to buy provisions. Benjamin, the youngest son, the fruit of Jacob's late love for Rachel, remained at home for fear that some harm would befall him. So Joseph's 10 brothers set out for Egypt, not imagining that the governor of that land, from whom they would seek sustenance, was the brother they had sold into slavery many years before. When they arrived in Egypt, Joseph's 10 brothers bowed down before him, with their faces to the ground, seeking to buy provisions. They did not recognize Joseph, who was now dressed in Egyptian clothes and spoke the language of that land. However, Joseph immediately recognized his brothers, remembering the dreams he had had when he was young. A wave of emotions washed over him, a mixture of pain from the wounds of the past and a realization of the divine plan unfolding before his eyes. He decided to test his brothers to see if time and suffering had produced any change in their hearts. With a stern voice, he accused them of being spies and questioned their origin and their purposes. Upon hearing this proposal, Joseph's brothers spoke to one another in Hebrew, unaware that Joseph understood their language. They acknowledged that they were suffering the consequences of the evil they had done to their brother many years before, when they saw his distress and did not listen to him. Reuben reminded them of his plea not to sin against the boy, but his words had been ignored. Now the guilt of his blood was upon them. Joseph, hearing this painful and sincere confession, could not contain his emotion. He turned away and wept bitterly. Afterward he returned and chose Simeon to be bound before their eyes and kept as a guarantee until they brought their youngest brother, Benjamin. The other 9 were allowed to take grain to relieve the famine in their families, but the shadow of their imprisoned brother hung over them. In addition to giving them grain, Joseph secretly ordered that the money they had brought should be put back into their sacks, along with provisions for their journey. His heart was torn between justice and compassion for his family. He longed to see his brother Benjamin and to understand if his other brothers had truly repented of their past actions. The journey back to Canaan was filled with apprehension and fear. When they opened their sacks along the way and found their money returned, fear gripped them. They questioned what God was doing to them, fearing that this powerful Egyptian governor was plotting something against them. When they arrived back to Jacob and reported everything that had happened, the news that Simeon was imprisoned and the demand to bring Benjamin caused even more pain and anguish to the already afflicted patriarch. The news that Simeon was imprisoned in Egypt and the demand to bring Benjamin to prove the truthfulness of their story plunged Jacob into deep sorrow and anguish. He vehemently refused to let Benjamin leave, remembering the loss of Joseph and fearing that some harm would also befall his youngest son, the only remaining child of Rachel. Reuben tried to persuade him, offering the lives of his own sons as a guarantee for Benjamin's safe return, but Jacob remained inconsolable. The famine, however, persisted in Canaan, becoming increasingly severe. When the provisions they had, brought from Egypt, ran out, Jacob realized that there was no other alternative but to send Benjamin in order to prevent the entire family from perishing from hunger. Finally, after much deliberation and persuasion, Jacob reluctantly agreed to send Benjamin with his brothers to Egypt. He instructed them to take gifts for the governor, hoping to appease his anger and ensure the safe return of both Simeon and Benjamin. They took balm, honey, spices, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds, the best products of the land of Canaan. With heavy hearts and uncertain about what the future held for them, the brothers set out again for Egypt, taking Benjamin with them. This time, the presence of Jacob's youngest son added a new layer of tension and expectation to the reunion with the powerful governor they so feared and whose true identity remained a mystery to them. When they arrived back in Egypt and appeared before Joseph, he saw Benjamin, and his heart was filled with deep emotion and tenderness. He struggled not to reveal himself immediately, controlling the tears that threatened to overflow. Instead, he ordered them to be taken to his house, where they would be received with a banquet. The brothers were confused and fearful by this unexpected hospitality, wondering why they were being brought to the house of this powerful governor. Joseph's steward tried to reassure them, saying that there were no ill intentions, and mentioning the money found in their sacks on the previous trip. Simeon was brought back from the prison, and the brothers' anxiety mingled with a thread of hope. The news that Simeon was imprisoned in Egypt and the demand to bring Benjamin to prove the truthfulness of their story plunged Jacob into deep sorrow and anguish. He vehemently refused to let Benjamin leave, remembering the loss of Joseph and fearing that some harm would also befall his youngest son, the only remaining child of Rachel. Reuben tried to persuade him, offering the lives of his own sons as a guarantee for Benjamin's safe return. But Jacob remained inconsolable. The famine, however, persisted in Canaan, becoming increasingly severe. When the provisions they had, brought from Egypt, ran out, Jacob realized that there was no other alternative but to send Benjamin in order to prevent the entire family from perishing from hunger. Finally, after much deliberation and persuasion, Jacob reluctantly agreed to send Benjamin with his brothers to Egypt. He instructed them to take gifts for the governor, hoping to appease his anger and ensure the safe return of both Simeon and Benjamin. They took balm, honey, spices, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds, the best products of the land of Canaan. With heavy hearts and uncertain about what the future held for them, the brothers set out again for Egypt, taking Benjamin with them. This time, the presence of Jacob's youngest son added a new layer of tension and expectation to the reunion with the powerful governor they so feared and whose true identity remained a mystery to them. When they arrived back in Egypt and appeared before Joseph, he saw Benjamin, and his heart was filled with deep emotion and tenderness. He struggled not to reveal himself immediately, controlling the tears that threatened to overflow. Instead, he ordered them to be taken to his house, where they would be received with a banquet. The brothers were confused and fearful by this unexpected hospitality, wondering why they were being brought to the house of this powerful governor. Joseph's steward tried to reassure them, saying that there were no ill intentions and mentioning the money found in their sacks on the previous trip. Simeon was brought back from the prison, and the brothers' anxiety mingled with a thread of hope. During the banquet, Joseph struggled to maintain his composure as the emotion of being near his brothers, and especially Benjamin, overwhelmed him. He served them generously, giving Benjamin a portion 5 times larger than the others, subtly testing whether envy still resided in their hearts. After the banquet, Joseph ordered his steward to fill his brothers' sacks with provisions, put each man's money back into his sack, and secretly place his own silver cup in Benjamin's sack. The next morning, as soon as they had left, Joseph sent his steward after them, accusing them of stealing his silver cup. When they were searched, the cup was found in Benjamin's sack, plunging them into despair and fear. When they were brought back into Joseph's presence, Judah spoke with passion and eloquence, offering himself as a slave in place of Benjamin so that his father would not die of grief. It was at this moment of deep remorse and sacrifice that Joseph could no longer contain himself. With his voice choked with emotion, he ordered all his servants to leave the room, and then he revealed his true identity to his brothers. Joseph's weeping was so loud that the Egyptians in the house heard it. His brothers were astonished and terrified before him. But Joseph, with love and forgiveness overflowing from his heart, calmed them, saying, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." Joseph then comforted his brothers, assuring them that what they had done, though evil, had been used by God for a greater good, the preservation of their family and many lives during the terrible famine. He encouraged them to bring their father and their families to Egypt, where they would be well received and have an abundance of everything they needed. The news quickly reached Pharaoh, who was pleased about the reunion of Joseph's family and offered the best of the land of Egypt for them to settle in. Jacob and all his household went down to Egypt, and Joseph received them with great honor and love. Joseph's story, marked by betrayal, suffering, and exaltation, culminated in reconciliation and family restoration, demonstrating God's faithfulness in fulfilling his purposes through trials and the beauty of forgiveness that heals the wounds of the past and opens the way for a future of hope and unity. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this journey through the life of Joseph, an example of unwavering faith in the midst of adversity and of forgiveness that transforms evil into good. May we learn from his story to trust in your sovereign plan and to extend grace to those who hurt us. If this narrative has edified you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more inspiring content like this. Your subscription greatly helps us to continue sharing stories of hope and faith. God bless you abundantly.